All right, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Another Bourbon Show. And I have never been this excited to have a guest as I am tonight. I want to introduce a guy who creates some of my very favorite bourbons. It's not a huge distillery. There's a good chance you haven't heard of it. If you have, you know it's good stuff, though. I want to introduce the master distiller from Spirits of French Lick, Mr. Alan Bishop. Alan, thank you for joining us.
What's up, man? Glad to be here. But I do have to correct you on one thing. So you said master distiller. It's actually master bullshitter.
Oh, okay. It's still a big title. It's still a big
that
deal.
title's actually already taken around here. That's why we didn't give it. Because that's just the three of us, pretty much.
Touche.
So I got to start off. I've got a question I have to ask. You've been on a ton of like respectable podcasts, and
right.
You're
How did I get on a respectable podcast to begin with? That's funny.
No,
that's hilarious.
The question is, why in the fuck would you say yes to joining us? That's
why
what
not?
I don't get.
Why not? I mean, I like talking to people, and I and if people are passionate about stuff, I will tell you this. I would go on somebody's podcast that shows that they're passionate about what they're into, and actually gives a fuck about craft distilling.
Yeah.
Over top of people who are doing it only because they need to associate their name with craft distilling in a fucking heartbeat. And I've said no to certain people in the past because of that, because you can tell what their intentions are. Mm-hmm. So if their intentions are either A, we don't really like your stuff, but you're getting too much attention, so we have to do something with you, or B, try to get me into a situation where, let them, kind of poke and prod at me a little bit, then I'll just tell them to fuck off. But if they're cool people and they're laid back, and you guys, I mean, you reached out to me like, hey, you want to come on? Fuck yeah, I do. I got nothing else going on. Let's talk.
Man, bourbon. That's awesome. That's awesome. When I told them that I was going to send you a message, I was a little bit drunk, if I'm going to be honest with you. And I was just like, I'm going to send him a message. The worst he's going to do is ignore me, right?
What'd you think I was going to do? Be like, fuck off. I don't, who are you? Strange.
I mean, I would have actually been okay with that. What would have frustrated me is if you ignored me.
Yeah. No, and that's also something I should throw out too. So for anybody out there who listens to this, if it seems like I've ignored you, it's not because I have actually ignored you. It's that things are moving so fast in that distillery right now with the single barrel program and everything. Like, I'm getting fucking lost on, like, losing track of days. I'm losing track of what time I have to go on podcasts, on what day, etc. And unfortunately, Jolie did leave the distillery a few weeks back. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
It's all good. She landed a good gig that you'll hear about in the near future. I guarantee it.
Okay.
So,
okay.
So I'm down one life coach, as it were.
Okay.
So.
Well, why don't we talk bourbon a little bit? So tonight we're going to be drinking this one right here, Lee Sinclair 4 Grain Bourbon. Before we do anything, Stephen, let's get every week, Alan, Stephen does a label rating of whatever it is we're drinking. So, Stephen, what do you think of this label?
Yeah, so first of all, it's always so nice to have somebody from the company on whenever I give one of these label ratings.
Well, your label ratings are shit anyway.
Yeah,
Alan, he gave Mellow Corn like a 3.0 out of 10. And that's a beautiful goddamn label, right?
Yeah, I'll be honest, I got the Mellow Corn shirt. I can't lie. I am particularly fond of that one. So.
All right. So everybody's a critic. I think that the Lee Sinclair, I definitely like the bottled and bond version more, and that's similar to like the Maddie Gladden label in a lot of ways, and I think that looks really cool. I'm a big fan of those. This Lee Sinclair, I think, so I have a bottle of the Weeder here as well. Don't mean to show off, but I do like this label a little bit better because I think that that the label is so, or the symbol is so cool. And unfortunately, I think that the Lee Sinclair bottle, at least not the bottled in bond, kind of lacks some of that character. It's mainly just a portrait picture. It does have the same sort of gold band, so I like that you can tell easily that it's still a Spirits of French Lick product. if you're familiar with it. So for all those reasons, I'm going to be giving it a 6. I still think it's above average and it looks nice, but it's kind of boring, frankly, and it doesn't have that real standout like a symbol like this, or it doesn't have that really sort of flashy presentation that the Maddie Gladden or the Bottled and Bond does. So
Yeah, I'll do you one better. I'll give it a fucking 3.5.
Well, you know what's funny about that? I have to say this. Steven, do you remember what you gave the Weeder label?
I don't.
I went back and I I took some notes on the so on the Weeder label.
I already love where this is headed.
I'm gonna quote here. Quote, it's a forgettable label. Quote, it looks like a carpet in a hotel lobby. I give it a 4 out of 10.
That's fucking awesome.
I need to flip flop these then. If that's the case, I need to flip flop these because I think that the symbol is so cool. I had it wrong, but I stand by the fact that it does look boring like a hotel. I'll go to the grave that it looks like a hotel floor.
Now to make up for it, we on the drinking scale, Steven gave it an 8.4. He gave the Weeder an 8.4. So nice. He even said, and I didn't write this down, but he even said, in the end, who cares what the label says? It matters what the juice tastes like.
What it tastes like,
so.
Right.
Right. And I want to say, my girlfriend wanted me to say that the Weeder is like the only bourbon she likes to drink, by the way.
Well, that's awesome.
For whatever that's worth, I think that that's really cool praise because, again, she doesn't drink any bourbon and she really likes the Weeder. So,
yeah.
And the Weeder's about to get updated. We've got the Bottled and Bond rebranded William Dalton. That's 100% ours in the tank right now, waiting on bottles to come in. So
I was going to ask you about that later.
Yeah, sorry, don't mean to hijack your show.
No, God, no.
On those earlier labels, though, no, you guys are right. What you're seeing on those early labels is a distillery trying to figure out who the hell it is and what it does.
Yeah.
And at the time we did not have. So Jolie had a little bit of art behind her as well as a little bit of graphic design history, and she really had an eye to figuring out what I wanted to do. And early on, it was very much me and the original owner kind of button heads a little bit, and so of course I don't own anything, so I lost that battle. So we've still got labels that look like that weeded label, and you're not wrong. So the background for that is actually an old Victorian era wallpaper is what that is. So you're not wrong. It's it's hotel fucking carpet. Yeah, it's exactly the same thing. But no one was more glad than me to see that shit go away, all the information be put on the front label of that bottle. And I am a huge fan of textured labels, as is Jolie, and we literally spent weeks looking for the right paper for those Bottled and Bond labels.
That's awesome.
I mean, we went through so many fucking paper samples. Like at one point she was calling me at home about paper samples, and I'm just like, Lee, why don't you just leave me alone and come talk to me tomorrow because I don't have them in front of me.
I'm listening to Morrissey. Leave me alone.
How soon is now? It's tomorrow. Oh, 2 Morrissey songs in one fucking.
So Lee Sinclair, it's 90 proof. This one is. The Bottled and Bond would obviously be 100. But there's no age statement specifically on this one, right? Okay. And so I've got the mash bill here, but why don't you tell us the mash bill on the Lee Sinclair instead of me?
Yeah, so that initial release was it should have actually said straight bourbon whiskey, which shows you how much attention the TTB was paying, because I don't think it's on the bottle anywhere.
Oh, it is actually. Yep, I missed it.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't seen that label in so long. I don't know. It was right at 2 years when we came out with that.
Okay.
So that mash bill is actually my oldest mash bill. So I started really started distilling when I was 15, for better or worse. And my grandpa and my dad helped me build a little 10-gallon still. And I've told that story a lot. The 2 rules were don't blow your ass up in the backyard and bring us something when it's worth drinking. Which is maybe good or bad. I don't know. I mean, my parents were always of the opinion, like, he's going to run into shit somewhere, might as well do it in the backyard. At least we can keep an eye on him. So they're also the same kind of parents that my dad would like, because we had a tobacco farm. He'd let me have friends over on a Friday, right? And we were teenagers, we could drink a little bit, whatever. But then he was that guy that would like wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning and be outside your bedroom window with a chainsaw, like, "You boys ready to work?"
Have your
So,
fun, but be ready to work too. Yeah.
yeah, because that's the entire purpose of letting friends come over when I was in my teens was, oh look, free labor, more free labor. Bring 5 or 6 of them if you want to. We'll get this done quick, which is great. Nothing more terrifying than, a bunch of 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds with tobacco knives. That couldn't possibly go wrong. So the first real mash bill that I came up with was that Lee Sinclair, and it probably wasn't exact at that time when I was 15, but that's when I first started using oats. And the reason I did that is that my dad and my grandpa, they wouldn't tell me anything about how to distill. They refused to tell me anything. So I knew all the things they did because I grew up around it, so. But what they were mostly doing was, sugar shine. So basically 50% corn, 50% sugar. They might throw some other grains in there if they had it, whatever. And then like a lot of apple brandy and peach brandy, because everybody around here had an apple tree or a peach tree in their yard, and they didn't want to mess with them. They just didn't want the hornets in their yard. So, hey, Bishop, come pick these up. So I knew that oats were a grain. I knew whiskey was made out of grain. Obviously, it started off as a sugar shine when I was 15. And I really threw the oats in there just because I'd never seen them use oats before. And I thought, well, why the hell not? Let's see what happens,
Mm-hmm.
And so even then, you immediately realize a few things about the oats. You get a very, Julie loves this phrase, creamy mouthfeel. That's an industry term. Not sure which industry, but there's a lot
actually.
there's a lot of long chain fatty acids in there. There's a sweetness and a softness, and then oats distill. Off the still, they distill almost exactly the way that they cook. I mean, they taste sweet. There's aromatic precursors in there that cause a little bit of like a gustatory illusion, where you almost think that you're eating, you're not drinking something, because that aroma is so distinct. So then when I was in my mid-20s, I sort of further refined that as I got further into home distilling, which is really just the PC version of moonshining. And then that's when I really got into developing that mash bill into 60% corn, 17 wheat, 13 oats, and 10% malt. At the time, it wasn't caramel malt. And that was really just a matter of playing around. So my first thought when I got into that in my mid-20s was, those oats are sweet and they're round, and wheat has can have a little cream cheese icing sort of flavor and aroma to it. To me, the two went together, and started to notice that you could get these kind of interesting, almost cinnamon undertones from it, almost like a snickerdoodle cookie sort of thing. And so from there, it really developed into the product that it is. I took it originally to Copper and Kings. We did do 2 barrels of that bourbon at Copper and Kings. I don't know whatever happened to them. I know by the time I left, the warehouse guys were hitting those barrels pretty hard. So they may have got wiped out. I don't know. I would love to see them roll out, because they'd be almost 8 years old now. So,
Wow.
And they were 64-gallon barrels that were full. So surely God, there's like 20 or 30 gallons left, you would think, but who knows? One of these days, I guarantee you, if they, may have changed now because ownership has changed. But I started saying, I guarantee you, if they roll them out, I'm not getting any credit off of that. But anyways, that was definitely going to be the first mash bill that I brought to Spirits of French Lick when I got back over here on what I call the right side of the river, on the north bank of the Ohio River. Basically because I wanted to play into the history of distilling in Southern Indiana, and of course that mash bill was originally from Southern Indiana. With me. Now, what I didn't realize at the time when I created that is that oats had been used in distilling forever. If you go back to 1840, 1850, Kentucky, Indiana, Southern Ohio, almost every farm distillery mash bill that you'll find will have either oats or oat malt in them, because oats were the number 2 crop in both Kentucky and Indiana at the time. It's what they had, and they literally disappeared from distilling in the U.S. scene because of the invention, or not the invention, but the widespread introduction of industrialization and what is the low rectification column still in Kentucky, because they're hard to run through a column still because they're sticky. Same reason that rye, they tend to run a lower potential alcohol on a rye mash, because it gets so thick and it gets so sticky. But you can even trace oats back to most of the original Scottish whiskeys, not what you'd think of as single malts now, but certainly that industry developed out of this. They almost all had oats in them. Irish whiskey, poachine, damn near always had oats in it. They were always a big part of those sort of cereal whiskeys. So there is a nice long tradition there. And then the name Lee Sinclair. So we always say it's not just the spirits in the bottle, it's the spirits of the place. And we have that, whole motto of respect the grain, which I can get into on the mashbill momentarily too. But
I love that motto, by the way.
yeah, thank you. There was a little headbutting over that motto back in the day too. That was a hard fought motto to get put out there. I'll tell you that. But we tend to name things after local people who have been forgotten by history or are not wider well known outside of sort of the Black Forest of Southern Indiana region. So Sinclair was originally from Greene County, Indiana, came to Washington County, Indiana. He was the son of a prominent merchant / textile mill owner in Chicago. So he came from some money. He's also descended directly from the Scottish Sinclairs. So he was very closely, aligned with Freemasonry and the Templars and the whole thing. And had spent quite a bit of time in Europe in his life. So he gets his mill up and going, does really well for himself here in Salem, Indiana, Washington County. By the late 1800s, he's got a pretty good little bit of investment money, and he hears about the springs over in French Lick, West Baden, and Springs Valley, which in the valley itself, there are a lot of sulfur springs and a lot of mineral springs that are supposed to be good for your health. So there's always been a little bit of a resort industry from the 1850s onward. So he buys what's called the Mile Lick Hotel in West Baden at the time, sets it up as a resort area. A couple years later, it burns down, and he's going to get out of the business. And the only thing that Sinclair loved more than business was his daughter Lillian. And Lillian, she really talked him back into building a new hotel. And he basically decided that if he was going to do this, that he was going to make it the Carlsbad of America, as he called it. And he wanted it to be, kind of the ninth wonder of the world at the time. So he had decided for this huge freestanding dome, and everybody told him it was impossible to build. And he just kept going from engineer to engineer till he found some dude in his early 20s who was like, I can do that. He'd never built anything before in his life. And I'll be damned, he pulled it off, and it's still there today. It was the largest freestanding dome in the world for nearly 70 years. But that gave birth to the casino industry that's there in Springs Valley now, with the first game room, as they called it back then. By the way, none of those casinos back in the day were ever legal. The only legal one that's ever been in town is the one that's there now. And the Indiana State Police was actually kind of put together to bring that area to heel to some extent. But we are directly across from the West Baden Dome and resort, and we're on Sinclair Street. I'm from the same county that Sinclair lived in most of his life. So it made sense to name that one after him in honor of him in particular. And there actually is another version of that we've not released yet that is a inverted mash bill to some extent. So we call it Lillian Sinclair, and we switch out the wheat for rye, and we switch out the caramel malt for honey malt. And then we use a yeast that we actually captured from a lagering cave underneath Earthbound Brewing in St. Louis for the yeast strain. So
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah.
So you and I were on a talk together for the St. Louis Bourbon Society, and you talked about capturing that yeast whenever you were chatting with us. Yeah. And I was going to ask you, did you have any plans for that yeast? It was,
yep.
That's cool.
So Lillian is actually really a little bit of like a love letter to St. Louis, in all honesty. That's really kind of what the plan for that product is. It may see some distribution in Indiana and a couple other states, but primarily that's the market that we want to go after with that product as sort of a thank you, because St. Louis really kind of helped get us up and going in a lot of ways very early on. So hoping that ball gets rolling a little more with a little more velocity now that COVID's kind of maybe calmed down a little bit. It seems like things are coming around.
Well, guys, Stephen, Ryan, I want you to try a little bit of this Lee Sinclair. I don't know if I haven't noticed if you've been sipping it or not, but you guys have not had it before, correct?
Correct.
Okay. I also introduced them to the weeder. So
nice. And just so you guys know, that Sinclair, that 2-year, when that's gone, it's gone. And I think we're down to a pallet, I believe.
Okay. So it's not coming back. It's just going to be bottled in bond from here on out.
Yep.
Okay.
Cheers.
Cheers.
On the nose, if you would have put up a bunch of whiskeys blind and you put this in one of the glasses, I would have told you it was the Weeder, because I'm picking up a lot of the same notes as the Weeder.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, they're very similar, mash bill wise. I mean, the Lee Sinclair is basically a modified weeder is really what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I get more floral notes from this than I do the weeder, though. Like I get the same, like the baking spice. So on that weeder episode, I told them, and on that episode you'll hear it, that when I first tried the weeder, I was super excited to get it. I brought it home that same night. I opened it up. I poured a glass of it, and I had never had it before. So I'm thinking, okay, it's a weeded bourbon. I'm expecting something along the lines of a Weller product, a Maker's product, a Larceny product, something in that general realm. And I took that first sip and I was just like, oh, this is shit. Now, hear me out. I gave it about a week and a half or 2 weeks. And I was like, there's no way that is not good whiskey. Let me give it another try. And I poured another glass of it, and I was just like, get it out of your mind of what you think it's going to taste like, and just have a sip of it. And when I cleared my thoughts and just drank it for what it was, I was like, oh shit, I was wrong. This is so goddamn good. But it was in my brain that it was going to taste a certain way, and it didn't taste that way. So my brain said, oh, you don't like this. But no, it was, and ever since then, I've gone through 4 or 5 bottles by this point. Like, it's,
and that's really the next big fight for craft distillers that are getting good at what they do. I mean, obviously, early on, a lot of us weren't fantastic, right? I mean, because there were a lot of people early on in craft distilling who'd never distilled shit ever in their life, not one thing. And a lot of people that probably shouldn't have been in the business, to be honest with you. But they've learned since then what they're doing. And then now, craft distilleries are opening, and they're hiring home distillers, which is exactly what you should be doing. Hiring home distillers or brewers or winemakers or people who've shown their passion enough to do this stuff at home. So the next big fight is not whether or not what craft distilling makes is good. The next big fight is, we have this, like you said, there's a spectrum of bourbon that you have in your head, right? You're familiar with these 6, 7 big companies. They're all using low rectification column stills. It's all we've been familiar with since really not just Prohibition, but almost since the 1870s because of industrialization. And they all make a very, very similar product to one another. There are obviously differences, but they're using the same mash bills, same process. Basically, all of them are using some derivative of a yeast that was derived from, first name slipping my mind right now, but from the bean family. Those yeast strains are all very closely related. So, bourbon before industrialization was huge, massive spectrum, different farm distillers doing different things. And that's what craft bourbon is getting to be, especially now getting down into regionalized grains, heirloom grains, yeast, etc. But it's going to take that educating your palate to understand, especially like a wheated. I mean, the only thing we did to change that out there is we switched to a caramel malt. We used the brandy yeast. And it's double pot distilled with no chill filtration. So pot distilled spirits, they're going to open up and taste way different than a column distilled spirit. They're going to be bigger, heavier, fattier, and they need that time in the glass for a minute. You can't. I mean, every whiskey benefits to some extent from breathing, but with a pot distilled whiskey, if you can put that in a glass and let it set for about 10 minutes, you're golden, and that's really what it needs.
Yeah. So I want to hear, Stephen, Ryan, I want to hear what you have to say about it.
I definitely catch those baking spices, and like on the nose too, that like snickerdoodle cookie you said earlier. I definitely get some of that. I love it. It's very non-traditional, kind of what everyone's used to now. It's just the same thing, it seems like. So it's refreshing to taste something that, I really like, kind of like it's kind of like sherry texture in a way when you drink, real full bodied. So yeah, I enjoy it, and I mean, it's going to be gone in probably a couple minutes here, and I'm disappointed because I can't find it in Chicago. Hopefully someday soon.
Check spirithub.com.
To ship it.
Yep. Yeah. They should have it. So
I think South Bend's as close as I get. So
gotcha.
But yeah,
gotcha.
Yeah.
Cool. So that 2 year to me always drank a little bit more, and so bearing in mind when I was doing this at home, you know, that mash bill, I used it so often because it made great white spirits, right? So why would it not make, you know, a fantastic brown spirit? But the 2-year-old to me always drank a little bit more like a sort of Highland, Lowland, right on the line single malt Scotch with no smoke, you know, so like
Yeah.
Glengoyne, Cardew sort of thing, where you get, you know, almost like Ceylon cinnamon, a little jasmine. There might be a little eucalyptus in there as well. But it was a good introduction for us, I think, as far as a distilled spirit to put out and get some attention. It was interesting initially too, because you know the traditional bourbon drinkers, they weren't really having anything to do with that version of it. But people who didn't know they liked whiskey or didn't think they liked whiskey, 9 times out of 10, I could get them on that one and they'd go for it.
You know, one of the things, you know, other than the like allspice and the baking spices that you get from it, one of the things that it's almost got a refreshing taste to it. Like the sweetness to me is not like the typical bourbon caramel sweetness. It's more of a light honey sweetness.
Yep.
And like like a crisp apple almost sense to
Very
it.
much
And
so.
that's the refreshingness that I'm talking about. That again, it's just something you don't taste a lot in bourbons. Like the Michter's, I'm a big fan of Michter's. They're my favorite large distillery. But yeah, you just don't get those types of flavors from the big 6 distilleries.
Yeah, and what's interesting about those flavors that you're pointing out in particular is that in the older expressions like the bottled and bond, those really go in that direction of like almost herbaceous sometimes. So they can go into almost like a menthol characteristic, eucalyptus characteristic.
Really?
With the Sinclair in particular is really interesting because because you don't create consistency on a pot still, right? You manage it over time by doing your blends together. And that's why we have such a fantastic single barrel program, because you can get all these different expressions out of that one, you know, line of product, not only with barrel differences, but differences in, was I pissed off and hung over on Monday and I cut things differently than I did on Tuesday or whatever, you know, there's a lot of different variations in there. So typically we get 4 main variations out of Sinclair barrels. So you get like almost a traditional oaky Kentucky bourbon weeded profile. Not a whole lot of those, but there are some of those in there. Then we'll get some that are very like jasmine floral, very to the forefront. You'll get that eucalyptus, and sometimes even get into the odd ones. There are when you lean more towards like horehound candy, which is really cool, and I love those. And then the rarest one that we get is just this cinnamon bomb that just almost like cinnamon toast crunch, or if it goes real heavy, you almost get into like big red chewing gum. It's insane how far that can go sometimes. And that particular profile is probably less than 1% of the barrels that we make. And if I knew how to replicate it, I'd replicate it all the time, but I have no fucking idea where that comes from.
Stephen, what do you have to say about Lee Sinclair?
So I just tried it side by side with the Weeder, and I think that I'm definitely picking up more spices, more baking spices, like we talked about here. And I think it's almost somewhere between, because I'm a big fan of turkey products, and I'm a fan of the sort of that spiciness to it. And to me, it's almost like you took a Wild Turkey 101 and some of that flavor profile and smashed it with the Weeder, because whenever I just had some of the Weeder a moment ago, it almost had like after drinking it for like a minute or so, I feel like there's almost like a chocolatiness in my mouth a little bit, or something like dully sweet, slightly bitter. But then with the Lee Sinclair, I feel like it's almost like a melon taste. Like the spice almost gives way at a certain point. And I was just gonna say, like I definitely more honey than anything. But then there's almost like a honeydew or something as well.
I can see that.
With you saying that, I agree. Like I wouldn't have said honeydew, but now I get it.
Yeah. And it's only there after like maybe, I took a drink 3 minutes ago, and now I'm just kind of like, tasting my mouth, and it's some sort of a melon or something like that. So I think that there's some more sweetness and a little less bitterness, but not that it's that bitter. I just can't think of another word for like sort of like the dark chocolate sort of aftertaste of the weeder.
Nice. So there, I'll tell you that part of the profile on all of our stuff is number two charred oak barrels as opposed to 3 or 4. So we do medium plus toast and number 2 char on all the barrels, all 53 gallon and larger. We don't use any small barrels or anything of that nature whatsoever. But that number 2 char is there for a couple reasons. So the first is because we're running pot still, we can make cleaner cuts, because a low rec column still you can't really make cuts off of. On a pot still, you're actually fractionating the alcohol based on what you smell and taste, etc. It's coming off different temperatures. So since we're making clean cuts, we don't need a 3 or 4, because really the char is only there as a filtration agent. It's basically there to pull out those things that you don't want to just kind of come over because of the method of distillation used typically in large distilleries. The toast is really where you're getting your sugars from. It's really where you're going to get your flavors from. And so that number 2 toast, what you get is more lignin. And that lignin gives like toasted coconut, toasted hazelnut, sometimes leaning towards that sort of Nutella sort of thing that you can get going on. I notice it more with Matty Gladden than I do with probably most anything else that we make. It's definitely noticeable there, I think, because of some of the contrast in Matty Gladden. But we do tend to get a lot of that. We also go in at a very low entry proof, so we go in at 105 on almost everything. And water is a better solvent on wood than what ethanol is. But that gives us a little more extraction even in a short amount of time, like the 2-year-old products we were doing. And it also brings some other things to the forefront. So you get a little micro oxidization a little quicker. You're not aging any faster, you're just aging differently, essentially. I'm not sure I made a point in any of that, but it sounded super fucking professional. And I made it through like 3 sentences and I didn't cuss. So,
well, why would you worry about that? We cuss all the damn time.
Yeah. I will say I remember the finish on the weeder lasting really long too. It's definitely a good mouthfeel. Yeah.
That was another thing I said about the weeder. I'm sorry, Alan. That was one thing I said about the weeder, though, is I said I would have been really interested to see that at a higher proof. I remember that as well, because I was saying at the time that it almost every single second it's in your mouth, it feels like there's a different flavor, and that goes through all the way through the finish. If that finish was, I just wish the finish was a little bit longer on it, because if it was, I'm sure I would experience like 5 or 6 more flavors.
Yeah, I think you'll really like this William Dalton, because so the thing with the weeder in particular was that was a blended straight bourbon for us. So it was 60% our 2-year-old stuff, and then it was the remainder was from I can't say the name of the distillery. It's ridiculous because everybody knows. It's from a state called Wyoming, and I'm sure there's like 2 distilleries there, and only one of them that makes any sense to have had 5-year-old bourbon that became 7-year-old at the time. So
I think if you go back to episode 26 or 28, I explained exactly which distillery it was.
I hate those fucking non-disclosure agreements. That's such a stupid like nobody fucking know. Publish your mash bill and we all know where your shit's coming from. God, it's ridiculous. It's right up there with these non-compete agreements and shit that people hire. I'm gonna rail on this for just a second because I have a platform here. So
yeah,
if you go to open a fucking,
it's not a big platform, we should say, but go on.
It's all right. If you go to open a fucking distillery and you sign somebody, don't make them sign a fucking non-compete agreement. That is the shittiest thing on the face of this planet. You're literally telling somebody that they cannot, if they don't get along with you and they have to go elsewhere, they cannot operate in the same field that they're a professional at. Fuck off with that. Yep. That is dumb. That's dumb. Treat your employees right. Don't be that way.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. I mean, I'm not in the business, but you're dead fucking right.
Well, you see another facets of life too. Jimmy John made his employees sign. Yeah. Even just hourly fast food workers. So
sandwich tech.
Yep.
Yeah.
I was gonna switch to a different topic, but then Steven and Ryan, you guys brought up something that it's the only question I have prepared for you, Alan. And how do you determine what proof to bottle at?
So early on, obviously, with those younger statements, since we tend to have that motto of respect the grain, you know, the idea being that grain has terroir, just like grapes have terroir. Pot still distillation is all about retention and concentration of flavor. We want to hold on to the positive aspects of the grain, no matter how old the product is, etc. We tend to approach distillation, since we're kind of coming from the history of Southern Indiana. Even with bourbons, we tend to approach it a little bit more like brandy distillers. So just like with a young brandy, it can be a little feisty, you know,
Mhm.
it can be fun. But if you drop to 80 proof, it just goes to water and it's
Yeah.
pointless. I've never heard anybody who is a serious, you know, drinker say, "Oh, I like 80 proof stuff." I don't think
Right.
any of us, none of us, you know, you'll take a brand you don't like at 90 proof over a brand you do like at 80 proof most of the time, right?
Mhm.
So 90 seems to be a good proof for those 2-year-old products. It's got just enough octane to it that they can still be feisty, they can still stand up, but they don't get so out of control with that grain flavor at the forefront and that ethanol nose at the forefront that it works. It works really well. And brandies tend to be the same way, especially American brandies. The bottled and bond thing, which all of our mainline products from here on out will all be bottled and bond.
So you don't have a choice at that point. If you
Right.
want it to be, yeah, okay,
Right.
okay.
And the rationale behind that was very much so, like, some of my favorite of the big distillers is Heaven Hill. And
Oh yeah,
I love that they've done, you know, the bottled and bond thing for as long as what they have. And I always wanted us to kind of be the distillery that other distillers wanted to come hang out at. You know, we don't necessarily have a tourism facility and all that stuff, although we do give tours. But I wanted to be able to do cool things that made other distillers go, hey, you know, they're really trying to do something there with this bottled and bond still, even though it's really deregulated now, still has a connotation to it. You know, the distiller's at least putting some time and effort and thought into it. And he's going to set on the product and pay attention to the product, etc. Bottle it at a certain proof, and 100 proof is a good proof to drink at, in my opinion.
Mhm.
You know, I always, every bottled and bond product that you know, or every product that I go to is typically tends to be a bottled and bond product or an overproof, although not crazy high proof. Um, on the single barrels, I don't like proofing those down at all. I hate proofing down a single barrel. We've done it a couple times for some good friends of ours in Texas, and I'll do it for them because they have good palates and they're really good at picking out which ones they think need to be at a little lower proof. But typically, our proof out of the barrel houses, if we come out of the tri cellar, which is a little more like a brandy cellar, they'll go up in proof. So they'll go from 105 to between typically 107 up to 114. And then out of the rick house, which is a little more like a Scottish style dunnage, they'll actually lose a little proof. So they'll come out around, we've actually had some that hit right at 100 proof, ironically, which is kind of cool.
Really?
And then they'll sometimes come out 102, 103, right in there. Now we do have some stuff we're doing with yeast, so we obviously play around with a lot of different yeast profiles. We use 2 different yeasts for every single product that you're going to taste on the mainline stuff. So we split our cooks into 2 halves. So day 1, 600 gallons, we're using a house yeast that we propagate ourselves. It's very good at bringing those grain profiles to the forefront. And then day 2, we use one of 3 different brandy yeast. But at the end of the season, we're going to run 60 batches of Sinclair. The last 3 or 4 batches, we will actually switch out the yeast to one of our heritage yeast strains. So either that St. Louis strain, or we have a strain from the old McCoy distillery here in Orange County, Indiana. We have a strain from the Daisy Spring Mill distillery, which is now Spring Mill State Park. We've got a strain from Cave River Valley, which is where Old Clifty was from. And we'll throw one of those strains in there, leave everything else the same, just switch out the yeast and see what that yeast does. And then we do a higher barrel entry. We'll do 118 on those. And the idea behind that is that you're doing twofold. So hopefully 4 or 5 years from now, you can come out with a gift pack, you know, 4 200 milliliter bottles of Matty, and the only difference is the yeast and the entry proof. But also, I call it targeted single barrels. So you never know what's going to become a single barrel. But typically, if you're after single barrels, you want something off profile. Well, these are certainly going to be off profile enough that they should have some qualities that would make them unique and interesting as single barrels in the future. They may turn out to be shit. Who knows? You never know. I mean, even if the distillation is good, and I think that people don't necessarily understand this, even if the distillation is good, even if it was a great white spirit off the still, doesn't mean it's going to age well, because the liquid that comes back out of that barrel is chemically not the same liquid that came off of that still. There's alchemy that happens in that barrel that you have very little control over. So
Yeah. Numerous times on this show, I've talked about how one of the things that fascinates. So I do science for a living. I'm a researcher for Penn State University.
Here we
So
go, guys. All right.
Yeah.
For
Hey,
our
shut the
frequent
fuck up,
listeners,
Steven.
go ahead and skip
Shut the
forward like 3 minutes.
No, but here's the thing.
I was really glad that you didn't say I'm a geologist.
No,
Because then
God,
I was
no.
then I was going to start tagging you in mud fossil videos like I do Amity. So.
No, so the only like the thing that I think is so cool about bourbon is that like there's a science behind it for sure, but there's also like an art behind it that you cannot control. And like and I just find it so cool. Like so we drink Buffalo Trace every now and then, obviously. And one of the things that I always talk about being cool about Buffalo Trace is how different the mash bill, like what they put in a bottle, changes so dramatically when the mash bill is the same. And the only thing different is where that barrel happened to go into a rick house.
Mhm.
And how, like, when they fill a bottle, when they fill a barrel with their weeded profile, they don't necessarily know whether that's going
What
to get
product it's
pulled.
gonna be.
Yeah, is it going to be a Weller Green Label? Is it going to be a Pappy 23? They don't know until they pull it out. And like, and I just find that's one of my absolute favorite things about bourbon is that, like you said, you don't know what's going to happen once it's in that barrel.
Well, that's one of my favorite things about the pot still thing, and why I love pot still distillation, because now you've introduced even more variables into it, right? So you can take everything in the world affects the pot still. So if we run Lee Sinclair in the wintertime, it takes longer for the top of that still to heat up in the wintertime than it does in the summertime. So you get a lot more natural reflux. You're driving your proof and your purity up, making a lighter style whiskey, whether you want to or not, in the wintertime than you are in the summertime. If you're running the pot still and you're getting ready to do cuts or anything of that nature, and you have a storm front roll in, you got barometric pressure coming in. It's like putting the brakes on the pot still. You can literally watch the yield drop off as far as how many gallons a minute you're getting off of that still. You know, if I'm sick, I'm going to cut a different style whiskey than I would if I'm feeling good. If I'm in a shitty mood, I'm going to cut a different style whiskey than I would if I'm in a good mood. People think it's crazy, but moon phases affect pot still distillation, and we've been tracking it for years. A pot still will run faster in a full moon than it will in a new moon. And I've got 8 years worth of data at this point to back that up and show that that's the case. All other variables being exactly the same, right? Pot stills themselves, each pot still is an individual. That's why you name them. It's an old Scots-Irish tradition. But you can have 5 pot stills made by the exact same company, made to the same specs in the same building, running the same beer, same person running them. And all 5 of those pot stills is going to give you a slightly different product. If I bring you in and I teach you how to make my product, even on my still, give you all the mash-in regimens, etc., you're not going to make the cut the same way as I am. You're gonna make the cut in a different place than what I would. So you have all those variables. And for me, that's what's fun about it. Like the most miserable you could possibly ever fucking make me in life is to put me in one of these huge automated distilleries where I have like a fucking clipboard, or I guess now it's a fucking iPad, whatever, you know, and like just babysit the numbers.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump off the fucking roof by the end of the day. That's what's going to happen.
You know, while we're talking about this, you know, like fine craftsmanship, I just wanted to bring up a recent bourbon I had, the Buffalo Trace Bourbon Cream. I finally got to try some last night. It was really good, and I just had some decaf coffee at night with it in it. It's pretty good.
Buffalo Trace Bourbon Cream is allocated in his area.
I'll just be the first to admit to you that you know, that Heaven Hill eggnog, I you know, I might have drank my fair share out of that just right out of the bottle at one point in time. So you know, I mean, you're gonna have a good Christmas until the next morning. So
another brother showing